All right, everybody. Welcome again to another stream of Chaos Reign here. I am known as Chaos Reign, as y'all familiar with me. Today's stream will conclude This is part 2 of Education for Servitude. And the one thing that I want people to take out of this stream, the first and second stream, is to have a clear understanding of your way of looking through education now, moving forward in the 21st century. I'm hoping that you listen to the conversation that Brother Amos had with the reporter. I forgot his name. I think his name is Milton. I could be wrong. I'll double check. But in the whole our interview is very telling about how we should, as people, African people, etc., look at education and what is necessary for the 21st century for our survival, in a way. And we should not take this as some joke thing, you know. So I'm going to continue on the stream with further commentary. So let's listen in for ourselves. Enjoy.
Very different emphasis there.
Let me answer this backflipping some. We talked earlier about the fact that in the 60s.
Pardon me. I sometimes want to get down to a little more practical implication of what this means. Mm-hmm. As a result, you see, of the control and the paternalism of Europeans over black people. You see, the other thing that we must recognize, even if the European becomes good and nice and accepts us and so forth, the fact that he would still be in control creates what we might call a benevolent paternalism, which still to a great degree helps to maintain this passive mode of thinking, this passive mode of knowledge. Now, when you get into the classroom, you see a child then that wants to be told what the answers are instead of how the answer can be attained. For instance, sometimes in my class, I give an exam, and we're looking at the results of the exam. And the first question you would get sometimes is, well, what is the answer to so-and-so and so-and-so? And I have to say, look, you must find that answer yourself and dig it up. The emphasis is quite often then on memorizing the answer. So therefore, reasoning as a tool for finding the answer is thrown out as such. And the child then is handicapped in that if he has not memorized the answer, then he fails the exam because he either knows the answer or does not know the answer. You get what we call one-shot thinking. You say, I'll shoot and guess at the answer. Quite often, it gets into a kind of thinking that depends upon personal feelings. Often I find in my classroom, which is predominantly black, sometimes that I have to get the students to separate personal feelings and hunches from dealing with a problem as a problem that is susceptible to reason, not as a problem that has an emotional attachment to it as such. But you see, when you remove reason and sequential thinking and active attacking of a problem as the mode of approach, then the person is thrown back on memorizing, on guessing, on going with impulses, and on being unsystematic in their approach to knowledge, upon waiting for someone else to give the answer. So what you see quite often with the black child in the classroom is somewhat of a miniature reflection of the orientation of black adults to white people. For instance, to a great extent, black people look at Reagan as some kind of white daddy. And we see this kind of business, please, in a sense, Daddy Reagan, don't do this. Or are we waiting for Daddy Kennedy to come back into the White House? And rarely do we hear a discussion about what are we as black adults going to do to solve our problem.
To pause for a second, as you see the mindset of the Negro mind is that he is looking for his parents, aka Caucasoid people, particularly European man, to come in and save them from the abuse, the traumas, everything that he inflicted upon them or upon black people for approaching or over 300 years, and we could say 400. But you have to understand that you are trained to look of lesser of yourself to solve your problems. Just like the education system, it trains you to a degree where you have to sit there and take memorization of certain words, phrases, numbers, etc. So you take a test, and then in return you get what we call a good grade, particularly A grade or B plus, whatever you want to call it, a passing grade. But as a human being, as a male, have you really concept understanding of how to solve that problem? Remember, universities are designed to make lack of critical thinking, so that when you are analyzing and thinking outside of yourself to solve your problems, some problems that could be even greater, or some problems could be minimal. Nonetheless, you are not having the mental capacity or the right training to solve your own problem. And this is done by design. So, like, for example, when we look at presidencies, that a lot of people wait every 4 years to go into the polls and select what we call the lesser of two evils. And you know me, I prefer no evil at all. But let's say you had to pick the lesser two evils. What are you giving this so-called evil a consequence or something to apply pressure to get what you need accomplished for yourself or for the whole or for the collective of the people? Remember, I tell you about critical thinking. This is one thing we lack and don't use enough in the black communities. And like Brother Amos Wilson said, that through this rigorous training, through pre-K to, I would say, up to college, this training, because remember, education is not educated, it's a form of training that reinforces your inferiority to someone else that's teaching you. So it keeps the game going, it keeps the mind games, it keeps the control of systems going because they already got your mind. But I'm not going more further than that. Let's continue on to the tape.
You see, this is communicated to our children, and it's communicated in a way that they too wait for the answer. But I think that we've been misled by our leadership, for instance. They think that we can consume our way into equality and sees equality as an equality of materials. So if I have the same car as a white person, if I have the same house as a white person, a similar job, then I'm equal. But you cannot consume yourself into equality. You must produce yourself into equality. And you move into equality and beyond by productive thinking. Because as long as you're consuming knowledge or you're consuming materials, the guy who is giving it to you or selling it to you is producing at the same time, which means that you never catch up with him because he's always 2 or 3 steps ahead of you. To a good extent, many of our students go into schools, college as well as secondary levels, consuming, and their minds are not being developed to produce the true means by which they will accomplish equality. Everything else is sham.
Just at a personal note, when I was going to school, okay, at an illustrious college in this area, I found many of the European philosophies, concepts, etc., to be totally irrelevant to my position in the world. But in my effort to come up with some kind of Afrocentric view, that I was stifled and received your C's and D's. And, how does a student? This is the question. How does a student who perceives that maybe Shakespeare, Milton, and these other people do not provide them with the crucial answers that they must find, how should they deal in this kind of environment?
That's a pretty difficult question in the sense of the kind of control that's maintained in the environment. It sort of leads to what I might call sort of a subterfuge, where sometimes you have to produce, as the Bible verse says, give unto Caesar what Caesar's, and at the same time, though, develop your own. Meaning that the black student quite often is placed in the position of having to regurgitate to his instructors what it is they see as important, while at the same time, outside of that sphere, developing his or her own knowledge through his or her own self-instruction as such. The other facet related to that is, I don't know whether we should really depend upon the European-oriented university to provide us with our cultural education.
It's not European I'm talking about.
but many black institutions are European.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right.
Very European-oriented.
Go ahead.
If Mr. Milton is not aware, I think that's the guy that's interviewing Amos, that all universities that you attend, either historic black college or not, they are run and controlled by non-black people. Per se, if you think about even back in the 1800s, mostly a few historic black colleges were helped structured and funded by European people, European men, Caucasoid men. And that's just the honest truth. So if he creates this institution that you go and you digest or consume information, he by obviously controls the mind. So, but y'all get what the point is.
As such, and the problem is, you have many instances with the so-called many black professors, is the fact that they essentially meaning that the black student quite often is placed in the position of having to regurgitate to his instructors what it is they see as important, while at the same time, outside of that sphere, developing his or her own knowledge through his or her own self-instruction as such. The other facet related to that is, I don't know whether we should really depend upon the European-oriented university to provide us with our cultural education.
It's not European I'm talking about.
but many black institutions are European.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right.
Very European-oriented.
Go ahead.
As such. And the problem is, you have many instances with the so-called many black professors, is the fact that they essentially are representatives of the European point of view. And the only philosophies and orientation they too have learned have been those philosophies and orientation. I think it means that quite often if the student's job that was begun in the 60s, where we established African studies and black studies program, has to be completed in the sense where these programs are not just mere electives or things you do while you have nothing else to do. They should be required, in a sense, for black students, and they should, in a sense, be the very first programs that a black student takes.
Why is say Shakespeare more important than Langston Hughes or James Baldwin? Why is that?
Because the Europeans perceive themselves as more important than non-white people, and it justifies their so-called superior position as such. It maintains and it helps to maintain the so-called unimportance of non-white people as such, and Hughes belonging to that category would not be permitted to be elevated there. It helps to maintain, of course, the power relationship as such, and to also build in values in the black student, to value what is not his as being more important, which then focuses his attentions and energies on what is European. In the sense, it helps to maintain what I call that hypnotized state as such. See, I don't see them as being valuable in the sense of teaching more or providing more knowledge. I see them as a part of the mechanism for maintaining a system of controls, and which is maintained not so much by knowledge, but by the refocusing of attention, the maintaining, and by the establishment and building in of values. It also reduces the revolutionary potential of Black people, because you cannot revolt against a people whose values you share. And therefore, it makes the educated Black, were he educated along Afrocentric lines and along philosophies that were very distinct and different from European philosophy, that would set him up then to actually then rebel against Eurocentric psychology and philosophy as such. But since he values that philosophy, the only thing that he can ultimately do is seek reformations to reform the systems, which is pretty much where Black leadership has been set. Now, it's not a leadership that's seeking to bring about a new world order, for instance, a world order that's based on, say, different philosophies, but one that seeks merely to share the material culture of whites.
We talked a little while ago about, you mentioned Milton and Shakespeare. This touches on something that you talked about earlier, that is the Marva Collins story out of Chicago, the Black lady who did some miraculous, quote, miraculous thing. Quote, miraculous thing.
In the context of this culture, yeah.
Right, with some black kids, excuse me. Deal with that, if you will.
Yes, Martha Collins has become quite a celebrity here lately, particularly as a result of her being on this so-called 60 Minutes segment, and as well as a recent drama based on her life. And I think deservedly so, in that she was able, through her own educational efforts, to elevate the intellectual functioning of Black children who ordinarily would have been put consigned to those categories we mentioned in the earlier show as being learning disabled and unable to read, and move them to such a level that they, as eighth grade students, were reading at high school or beyond high school level, that their scores, their level on various standardized tests were 4 and 5 grade levels beyond what they were, what they would normally be as such. And that is somewhat of a miracle in this country when you've been fed the philosophy that Black children cannot learn.
Let me pause right here. And for those that we listen in, make sure you leave a comment to the end of this podcast or stream. Also like it. And I do want to hear from you. To pause, let me show y'all something this. What you're seeing here, these are the 4 books. What Amos is discussing is a teacher in Chicago or a woman controlling the actual education of Black children. And as what he said earlier, that they are reading much more advanced than the average or typical Black children that goes to the average public school system or a charter school. But I would say public school system because the interview was done back in the early 90s at most, or late 80s. And one of the few books that he talks about how you can get the best or how to bring out the best out of your children is right here. The pink book on the right corner says Awakening Natural Genius of the Black Child. A must-get read book. I advise any parent, male or female, to have this book. This book came out in 1992. Normally we're in the 21st century. This information that came out is roughly 20 years old, but still has some key points that all parents could follow to help develop your child's capacity to learn. What things you could do, exercise, to develop their minds in a way. So this is the book you should obtain. Moving down. But for chronicle history, since I have this image up here, the first book that came out, 1978, is The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child. This was the first book by Amos Wilson. The second book, which he did not publish till like 12 years later, is now roughly 30 years old, is Black on Black Violence, the Psychodynamics in Servitude to White Oppression and White Supremacy, etc., or White Domination. This book was released in 1990. This book was really composed, if we want to keep it 100, to really break down the psychological aspects of why Black people, Black men, or just in general, kill themselves at a certain rate. What goes in the psyche of the Negro mind and why he will commit violence towards himself and to others. This book has a better, more understanding with information and little short research, or actually extended research, in the dynamics of this myth of the violent Black male. Get this book as well. On the lower ends, the second book that deals with solution parts is actually two different books, but the book that came out the next year was Understanding Black Adolescence. This book deals with strategies and brief, deep, and I mean like deep analysis of how you could deal with Black adolescents in regards to behaviorals, etc. And mind, this is a summary because I read this book last year, so I can't give you too much in depth. This book right here is a really short read. This is like under 100 pages, so this is another good book to get understand how you deal with Black adolescent boys in particular. So these two books are pretty much a good to have in your library. The fifth book is titled The Falsification of African Consciousness. And in this book, it deals with this thing about consciousness in its entirety, especially if you're a so-called melanated man. Are you really conscious, or is this falsification? And he gives his critique, his research on this thing about consciousness in its entirety. This book came out in 1993. And as you know, before we go on to the last 4 books, these were the only 4 books that Amos wrote, especially, and was published while he was still alive, up to his death of January of 1995. So, as I continue playing, I will tell the last 4 books what they really are. So let's continue listening on.
And that they are not interested in learning, and they have all of these deficits. It illustrates in a very practical way that a caring person, a concerned person, or a teacher in this instance, can change and revolutionize a child's way of thinking and dealing with the world and elevating that child's level of thinking. It has many other things about it, too, that I think are commendable. One of the things is that we, as Black people, can elevate the thinking levels and change the thinking levels of our children in any way we desire if we assume control of their education. And one of the things that you find constantly, and Marvel Collins is one of many situations where Black children are reading now 3 and 4 grade levels, doing math 3 or 4 grade levels beyond their current grade. That's merely one story among many. You go almost into any major urban area now, you can find Black academies that are accomplishing very much the same thing in terms of scoring. The first thing you find then is, of course, that control is necessary to have control over the learning process. I think where the integrationists misled us is in thinking that after people have told you that they don't want your children, that they think your children are inferior, that I don't think they can learn. And after we know that these people maintain their position in the world by maintaining us in subjugation, I thought it was somewhat ludicrous that you would expect these people to actually do an adequate job of educating black children. And that's a paradox that I find almost stupendous. And yet we have been led to think this as black people, that all we had to do was throw our children in with white children, and somehow, through osmosis or what have you, they would just come out. And that has not been the case. The other thing is, of course, no one will love your children more than you do. And teaching techniques and educational psychology and all of that is no substitute for caring and concern and belief in one's children. And the Collins story, the Marvel Collins story, you see then the immense value of caring and concern. One of the things we noticed, for instance, when I studied those programs that had boosted the IQ of black children and the intellectual function of black children, is that you can get programs of very technical approaches to teaching that ultimately it turns out not to be the method of teaching nearly as much as it turns out to be the belief in the children, the expectation that you have regarding the children, the love and concern that you have for the children, and the setting of high standards for those children and demanding that they meet those standards. And therefore, once you have these major ingredients, you can almost come in with any kind of technical approach.
Thank you. We have to come back to part 3. Mr. Amos Wilson, thank you very much.
For a brief pause, it goes back. This is my thing. Why I think a lot of parents don't see the real value of their children, because they feel that by doing nothing, that this non-black person will give your child the necessary tools for them to compete, to not, I would say, overthrow, but to work for them. And we know no group or race of people can feel comfortable leaving the fate and destiny of the future of their children or their race by another group of people and think that you're going to survive. And the only reason why the black man, black woman thinks like this is because they have been conquered subconsciously, mentally. It is so real to the point where you feel that by picking, like I said earlier, less two evils, that it ensures safety for comfort for their existence in an environment that they don't really control. That's scary. That's insane. You think about it. And you think that the way how the system's structured now and how things are set up now, well, a lot of unemployment on the rise, things are going up, and eventually people are going to be left on the streets. You think a race of people could continue thinking like this? I don't think so. But, like I said, what I know, I'm just babbling. But let's continue.
Mr. Wilson, in part 2, you were talking about the lessons to be learned from the Marva Collins story. Would you continue, please?
Yes, the Marva Collins story in terms of a black teacher who founded her own school and who raised the so-called intellectual functioning of black children to a far beyond what we call average functioning. We made a couple of statements in the previous program around the issue of caring, the fact that this is, I think, one of the major things that was operant in moving her students toward this high level of functioning, that she cared, she exhibited love, concern, and high expectations, set high standards. You see, one thing about the psychology that is prevalent about black children is that they are suffering from a learning deficit, or that they are less motivated, or these other kinds of issues that we hear. It lowers the expectation of the teacher, and the teacher gets exactly what she or he expects from the students. The whole thrust of what I have been referring to as Eurocentric psychology is to lower the expectation concerning the intellectual functioning of black children and black people in general. Of course, that was the result of history that said blacks didn't have culture in the whole business. Now, the thing that you find functioning in her school, of course, is the removal of this kind of poisonous philosophy from the minds and psyches of these children. And she does this through the process we just mentioned. The other thing that I liked about it, and I like about what she's doing, I should say, is the fact that she is doing it without so-called federal funds and monies from the so-called federal government, indicating that with a relatively meager amount of resources, what can be done. And that the teaching of children and the elevation of the minds of black children is not determined in any direct proportion by the amounts of money per student spent. In a direct sense, of course, it has advantages, definitely, I wouldn't deny that. But it's not also based upon necessarily the so-called condition of the school, the physical, material aspects of the school, as much as it is embedded in human relations. In other words, equipment, videotapes, and all of this kind of stuff is no substitute for a teacher that cares, that is concerned, that is dedicated, that expects. And governmental funds will not, by the mere issuing of them to black areas, elevate the intelligence of black children. That has been one mythical liberal solution that has been thrown at black people, that the way to solve a problem is to throw more money at it. And therefore, our leadership effort has been to, if you got a problem, give us more money. This somehow is going to do it. It never worked. As a matter of fact, you almost see a situation where the more money that's put into a system sometimes, the less you get out of it. What I guess some economists call diminishing returns. So in those instances, the control of education that I referred to in the previous thing, that is where black people must control the education of their children, which is illustrated by Marva, the removal of dependence upon the federal government, because you don't not only get money from federal government, you get directions, and it is this directions of bureaucracy that too has destroyed the potential of our children. The concern and love for black children, all of those things are positive. I have one major reservation about what she is accomplishing there, and that is what I would call the Europeanization process that I see operating there.
What do you mean?
What I would see is an overemphasis on European scholars or European authors, the Shakespeare, the Chaucers, to the relative neglect of people of African descent, writers and scholars and people too, who have done work that should be emulated by black people. Also, not intentional, I would think, on our part, but perhaps inadvertently the belief that one can achieve intellectual functioning only by the assimilation of European ideas, and that the assimilation of European literature is the base for which one must build a higher intellectual function. I'm afraid that what you will have is what we have now in too many instances, if you follow the logical progression of what's happening here in that situation, of students who will be functioning on a very high intellectual level, but who, in a practical sense, will be of little value to the black community, because their orientations, their tastes and values will essentially be European, and therefore the work that they do will essentially support the European structure and have to maintain European dominance. To a great extent, this is what you have going on in America today. The vast majority, or at least a large percentage of black children, are kicked out of the system because they don't assimilate the European philosophy. Those few blacks that are let through at the price of alienating themselves from blackness. and from Afrocentric ideas. So you have a situation here where you may get more black MBAs, Masters of Business Administration, okay, more blacks who are economics majors, and yet you see the black communities crumbling economically. You get, for instance, you get more black psychologists, and yet you don't see any visible or any demonstrable effect of those blacks in a positive sense on the black community as such. It appears then, even though we are educating so-called more blacks, its effects in a positive way on the black community has been negligible. And I think this is in part due to the fact that blacks are Europeanized and therefore not trained to think in terms of how their knowledge and information relates.
Let me ask you this.
Let me pause right there to give a little background on this. Have y'all noticed a lot of black men in the space on YouTube? How they talk about the black community in a way like they're alienating themselves from the black collective. And one of the biggest issues they have is, and I have my plights with the women in the community, but mostly is derived by the coochie or the access of women. But this what happens when you get a Eurocentric educational system. And the ones that don't and fight against the program itself, you hear stories, some don't finish high school. And I would say it's a two-way street when black boys that become boys and teenagers drop out of high school. Is one, and one of the main reasons that the school system can't relate to them. And they should, because most of the staff is mostly 80% non-black. So there's a problem in that itself. But also that they were ill-equipped and prepared for the levels of what I like to call training. And it's not like most black boys and girls are slow and they don't understand material. Just like my another good scholar, Nicole, said it best. She taught STEM, science, in universities for maybe a year or two. And for her understand and reason why the few males that in her class that pass it with flying colors drop out and go to what Brother Amos said about get MBAs, marketing business administration, is because they don't see the value of not only learning and getting a degree, but utilizing for their interests. Because think about it, you get a STEM degree. What institution that you can go right now that black people have built for you to utilize your talents and gifts and skills that you acquire or what you put in work in? Where is it all going to? This is a question that we don't really ask ourselves. It's going right back to them. And hello, Miss Briggets. So, yet again, we have to really ask the question: is your education serving you, or you are serving it for others? Or I like to call it education for servitude. This question is going to always be bestowed upon every man and woman that's listening to the stream.
The advancements of black people.
Down to solutions. What do you have to do to begin to get a black child to think from an Afrocentric perspective?
Well, certainly we would like to have the parent, him or herself, or both of them obviously, to have what we call the Afrocentric view, and that is a black parent who is familiar with African history and African culture, and who has what we call the goal in mind of advancing the interests of black people in terms of themselves, not just in terms of other people as such. I think that is a prerequisite. Certainly, the home environment becomes of key importance here in developing this Afrocentric view and of emerging the child in things African. I'm not necessarily one who advocates the preaching of Africanness at children, because quite often it may reverse the very process that you want to bring about as such. But a sort of subtle emergence of the child into the ways of African culture, such as taking them to events that are African oriented, and of course filling the house if possible with books that have the African orientation as such, or sometimes critiquing the obvious control mechanisms that are apparent, say, in TV when the child is sitting there looking at it, and to a degree sometimes even shielding the child from programs such as the different strokes programs, things of this nature, so that they will not be insidiously.
What do you think about that program?
I try not to, to tell you the truth.
What would you just for us today?
Yes, I think it's a dangerous kind of program, frankly, to be honest. Different stroke. Because again, it's a program where the paternalism of whites is built in, and almost the idea that whites somehow can provide a much better paternalistic environment than blacks. By implication, there is the idea that blacks don't care enough about these kids to have adopted them themselves or to have taken care of them, or the Black Family Network could not, that those relatives, let us say, of those kids would not have taken those children into being. But the main thing, it internalizes this concept of the white man as a problem solver for black people. As a man, even in a benevolent way, is going to take care.
The white shadow.
The white shadow is another instance. Here again is the great problem solver. And to a great extent, the problem of our people is the white shadow. By that I mean quite often we as people are unable to see each other as real, because we more or less look at each other through the spectacles that the white shadow has placed on us. And a lot of what we call the so-called lack of unity or struggle that goes on within the black community is built on false issues that have been handed to us by the establishment as such through these kinds of programs.
I think something that probably needs to be cleared up is, and that is, I would imagine that when some people listen to you talking about the need for Afro-Americans to get into the African identity, whatever, that it is somehow unnatural, and somehow something that should not be done, and it's offensive to other people. What about that? I mean, do people insist that a pear look like an apple, or what? How do you explain that? How do you explain that?
Certainly getting into an African perspective, and by that I mean not necessarily going back to Africa. This is sometimes people confuse that when you mention African perspective. I see an African perspective not only as something you go back to in terms of roots, but as something to be developed as well by African people. You see, because certainly as wonderful as our historical past is, we certainly have to adjust to the stresses and strains of the modern day world. But that must be developed not as a hand-me-down philosophy, but as one developed out of our own experience as a people and our own economic and social situations in the world. And it's based upon a cultural, social, political analysis of where we are now, with a deliberate and conscious setting up a program for the kind of culture that we want to develop. So that would be as African or Afrocentric as the past ones were Afrocentric, say, before the periods of colonialism. That is going to offend people. And
when the Italian speaks of being Italian, well, what is the difference? seems to be, some people say it seems to be okay. But when the black man speaks about being black, it's somehow...
Certainly, I think the black man speaking of being black is certainly more threatening than, say, the Italian speaking as Italian or French as a Frenchman, because in a sense, the Frenchman is still European in that sense, and is talking about it within that structure as such. But when you're talking about, and of course, whether it's Italian or French or what have you, are still part and parcel of the benefits that the European culture as a whole gains from maintaining the subjugation of our people. But when you talk about an African as an African, the implications are that they will no longer be able to exploit us as a people. That's threatening, of course, because their economic and social order is based upon our exploitation. And therefore, in a very human sense, certainly it should arouse anxiety and fear to a good extent when you hear this kind of talk. The black nationalist is frightening because in many ways, he in another way is very much like the white man who is nationalistic and is very much concerned about maintaining his group. And he knows that involves maintaining power as such. And so therefore, when another people begin talking about maintaining their group and building up their group, it means that power has got to be redistributed, and as well as the economics and social benefits that go with it. As long as a black, though, indicates that he wants to be American, or he wants to be integrated into America, then that is less threatening because it indicates that he is basically going to support the system, and he's therefore not a threat to the system as such.
As you look at education in this country, black and schools.
To pause, you know why they always want to know when a black man or black woman always concerned when they say they want and respect not only themselves but their race that is a problem to other race people. And what Brother Amos said it best, because it's frightening, because it's a sense of loss of control. Because you got to understand, everything you do, from what you spend your money to how you interact, procreate with people that's not part of your group, it is a sign of you are submitting your will and giving full authority and control to others over yourself. When you as a person or race people decide, say, I don't want to play this game and I like to go elsewhere, it will be problematic because you live in a system, you live in a world where everything is based on control, dominance and control. That has not changed throughout human development in centuries. And we can go as far as 1,000 years. And you will never see it change now. So the better that black people as a whole get a clear understanding of this, you will never come out of your problems. You will never come out of what they call systematic oppression. Not even yourself or your children that's coming up will never, because you still continue to participate and play this game. And, other groups of men and women will play the game with you, as long as they benefit. Yeah, they'll play this game all day, every day with you. For their own preservation, mind you.
What do you think black parents should expect from these public schools, and what they should not expect to flow from these public schools?
And not only public schools, militant, but also charter schools, because now we are moving from the stage of public to charter. I'll give you an estimate or a scenario of what you're going to expect moving forward in all institutions that you do not control. You're going to see the same game being played. You're going to still be miseducated. You're going to still follow the orders, and you're going to still walk into the wolves. That's what's going to happen.
I think they should expect certainly what we might call a very solid education, particularly in what I would call the skills, the math, the science, and so forth. They should not necessarily expect these schools to properly educate their children culturally. I think we should take care of the cultural education of our children ourselves. I think they should not have to send the children there thinking that the only way they will love themselves is by getting their white counterparts to love them, or seeing the love of their white counterparts as being important to their self-image as such. So in that sense, I think we should see them as more or less the places where we get the technical knowledge and information necessary for us, of course, to attain jobs and occupational levels that are desirable for us, and to attain the skills that are necessary for us to develop our own resources and so forth. But the more spiritual, cultural side, we should see to it that we ourselves
are independent black schools on the rise in this country.
Oh yes, definitely so. Sometimes for many the same reason that independent white schools are on the rise as well, because of the fact that we recognize the public school to a great extent has failed in its mission to properly educate our children. Also for the fact that the value system is so nebulous and sometimes non-existent until the character development of the children suffers to a great extent, as well as the cultural sense of the cultural identification of the children suffer too in the public schools, because it's gotten to the point now where there is no reigning kind of cultural ethos in the schools.
What do you mean?
Where, we mentioned in a program back, where there is no agreed upon set of values that guide the teachers and the students in those. Also because the authority level in the schools has been basically taken away from teachers and as well as parents. And so there is really hardly any place in a school, for instance, you can really point to that is the center of what is right, what is wrong, what is demanded and not demanded as such. In the independent school, you see, you can build this kind of thing into the school. It's built around a definite value system, cultural orientation, political orientation, and for black people, it's built on a much higher expectation level. It's not built on deficit psychology, deficient psychology, and it believes in its children, and therefore you get a different kind of product. Plus, the parents in those kind of schools can have much more of a say and are quite often a part of the school itself. The public school, for instance, has become quite alienated from the community to the extent where many parents feel as if what they have to say cannot be heard. They cannot actually influence in any meaningful way what is going on in those schools.
Are there some specific things that you can point to? If you can't, I would understand that. But are there some specific things that you can point to that we as black parents do in our homes that serve to work against us insofar as our children are concerned? Are there some specific things?
I can't think of any, and if I were to, I would have to be very cautious because I try to avoid.
It's not a listing process.
Right, and also to avoid the blaming of the victim kind of thing as well. Because pretty much if the black parent quite often is working against what we might call the interests, and that's hard for me to perceive with black parents, as a matter of fact, doing of black children, is principally due to the kind of propagandizing and brainwashing that has been laid upon the black parent in lowering the expectations concerning our children. One thing that is of interest, we have done some work and study that shows, for instance, the knowledge about one's children is what we call positively correlated with their intellectual functioning as well as with their psychological functioning. If there is maybe something that black parents may be doing that's working adversely against their children, it may be the lack of real knowledge about the development of black children and being aware and being sensitive to those children's growth and how that growth is related to, as we pointed out in our first segment, the African experience as such. So in that sense, we can see it. The other instance may be the lack of gaining what I might call very practical knowledge about how goals are to be accomplished. For instance, when you compare, say, motivation levels, that is, of black parents in terms of what they want their children to achieve and what kind of professions and things that they want their children to go into, you find that the black parents' motivation is higher than the white parents' motivation in this instance. So you're not suffering in the black family from what we call aspirational levels. Nor even when you even say, look at the aspirational level of black students, you find that aspirational level too is higher than white students, you see. So apparently what you're lacking is not necessarily the psychology of the desire for the child to achieve, but perhaps more of the practical knowledge of how that achievement is to be brought about, which means then that the parent possibly could gain from learning in terms of what is required in terms of their own political action, their own politics, in terms of the school, the PTA, for getting what they want for their children. And I see it in more institutionally oriented than otherwise.
We're going to try to summarize a bit.
Yes.
You talked earlier about the need for young people, young blacks, to get into technology. Would you go over that again, please?
Yes. A side note. And those that's listening and will listen to it, hit that like button if you can. I have to agree with Brother Amos that there are a set of parents, black parents, that do emphasize to agree they want their children to do a little better in all areas, especially in education. My only problem is how much do we really put into proper educate our boys and girls, especially the boys. And the reason I'm going to keep reiterating the boys because the girls are fine right now in regards to the basics of education, reading, writing, arithmetic. They already got that down packed from pre-K to 12 and maybe college, if some of them finish college. But the biggest concern overall, if you really want to change this around and change the climate of, especially here in America, you have to really start focusing on how you're going to better these boys. It's not going to skip us as a collective if the boys are continue to get malnourished in those areas of education, or we like to call training. If you want a better future, you're going to have to put money and emphasis on the boys. There's no way around it, ladies. So let's continue.
You're making reference to the sort of one-sided approach we use sometimes in looking at civil rights as the very ultimate thing. I think there has been a confusion in the black community of liberation and civil rights. Instead of thinking of achieving civil rights as being equivalent to being free, as such, or as equivalent to being in a position to enjoy the so-called fruits of life. But we must not forget that prisoners have rights, and you can demand your rights, and therefore to merely have rights does not necessarily mean that one is free or one is in a position to achieve what one wants. So what we have here, we may have equal opportunity, in a sense, say in the occupational field. But if we do not prepare our children to master this technological system, then while we may have equal rights on the books and equal opportunity on the books, we'll have a situation here of still being in a position economically subordinate to other ethnic groups. The other thing that we have to look at, though, is the real impact on the world, in the world of black people, is not going to be in the area of rights as much as it's going to be in the technological changes that are taking place. And we must look at those technological changes in terms of where we're going with our children, the education of our children. For instance, we mentioned there's a situation that I was reading in one magazine, High Technology, that speaks of a Japanese factory that manufactures something like 1,300 cars a day and only has 67 employees in it. And of course, things that are happening in Japan now where robots are manufacturing robots. We, as a people, must begin to look at these kind of developments and their impact upon our children and upon us. In a sense, I think with equal emphasis as we look upon civil rights, because we may end up with the civil rights and still end up unemployed.
You say racism will become less and less of a factor.
Apparent and obvious racism is going to become, and is becoming, less and less of a justification for maintaining blacks in supported positions. You have one author, for instance, out of Chicago, who has a book, I think, called The Decline of Race. Something.
Significance of Race.
Yeah, The Declining Significance of Race. I think, though, that is a mythology that's developed because we have, again, not understood how whites use mythology to control and maintain control.
You got 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay. That's right. And, for instance, race becomes an important mythology when you want to colonize the people, when you want to enslave a people to sleep well at night. So you use racism to justify the position that you're keeping them in by saying, okay, they deserve it because they're inferior, they have no culture, and the whole business that we are so familiar with. Now, and also to justify your own exploitation. Now, when that exploitation is accomplished, and you have built a network that's based on economics, as the Europeans have built, and you have built a network that's based upon communication systems, and you have reoriented your colonized people where they value what you have to offer, racism as a means of controlling them is no longer necessary. As a matter of fact, it reduces your costs. It reduces the obvious conflict because now control is placed on the basis of other factors. So now you can pass an equal housing law and say, well, you're welcome to get in any house you want to, except the fact you can't afford to buy it.
5 seconds. Why am I feeding and clothing this black child? What's the goal?
The goal is to make this black child ready to take over the world and take his rightful position in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that's the end of that part 2 section. And let me put this back up here again. For those that didn't see this, I'm gonna give you a rundown of the books. What you're seeing here, up to the 4 books I read earlier. The 5th book, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Actually, the 5 books. The 6th book was released 3 years after his death, titled "The Blueprint for Black Power." This book came out in 1998. The 7th book that he released was Afrocentric Consciousness in regards to New World Order. Now, mind you, you hear about this NWO for some time now. And what's his name? Jerry Clark talked about it. But one thing that black people have never understand is what is your place in the so-called restructuring of a so-called new order? or actually exist in orbit, because there's nothing really new of anything. Because if everything is constantly running properly as it should be, if it's not broken, you don't need to fix it. So that's the premise of this particular book. And in that book, it goes into the history of Garveyism and what Marcus Garvey been saying back in the 20s and how it holds weight today. So that's another good book. 7th book you should get. The 8th book. This was something that was written in, I believe, 2017. But before we go to 2017, the Afrocentric Consciousness and the New World Order, that book was released in 1999. This was released a few months before the end of the 20th century. And you didn't see no new publication from Amos, but from his best friend Sabatu. He released called, I think it's titled Black and White, Manhood and the dealing with things, looking at for black and white. This is more of a manual / book that gives a more of a in-depth look that will lead into what we call the blue book, titled Understand Black Male Adolescence. The 2 books that you see up here, if I could see personally, and let me get the actual title of it, because I don't want to run off my mouth. The issues of manhood in black and white is dealing with an exclusive look into masculinity and the societal definition of African man. This book, that's close to 100 pages, it gives you more in-depth look of the definition of what is manhood, how black people or African people view manhood. This, like I said before, it ties into the adolescent book, which really should have been written before you get the adolescent book, because how you could fix black male adolescence and coping with issues if you don't understand the direction of righteous passage that will lead young black males into the stage of manhood. So this book right here, which I advise every parent, especially if you're a mother, you should pick up and read and give to your son if your son is able to read properly. And usually these books should be read by you first, then give to your children second, for better understanding, especially if you're raising your sons so they have a certain understanding or a template that way they don't get from the school system. And finally, the last and final book that was just released, and this one is on the left-hand side, as you can see here. It is titled The Psychology of Self-Hatred and Self-Defeating Towards the Reclamation of the African Mind. This was written by Sabatu. This book dealt with 20 hours of a lecture dealing with what is self-hatred, why black people self-hatred, what is psychological implications of self-hatred, and does it lead to self-destruction, or like to call self-defeating? Because if you self-hate yourself, you are in the direction of self-hatred and self-defeating. And anything you do in regards to reclaim your natural mind will be nothing. You won't make an attempt. You think everything you do out here is normal. You will be defeating and you will lost in the battle of your insanity to what you are as a man, what you should be doing. So that book, and also not to men, but also women, because this also relates to men and women, because it breaks down the psychology entirely of black people and why they think and behave the way they do in regards to self-hatred towards each other and themselves. So that's the I think that's the 10th and last book. So let me count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 books, sorry. 9 books. And this book came out in 2020 of January. So these are all books that you could look into yourself, buy, collect, wherever, and read for yourself. But in wrapping up this, let's be honest and be clear. Because we live in a technical age now, the only thing you can do now is move forward to have a better future for your children. And the directions that black people should take now moving forward, if they're serious, is how can I prepare my children now for the future, besides anything else? If you think about it, there's no salvation at all. No one's going to come save black people. I know black people, either they want to believe it or not, it's the honest truth. And they shouldn't expect no one saving, because only people that will save themselves is you have to save yourselves. One thing I liked about the whole entire interview is the man was hitting on points, asking question after question about the problems, and Amos gives a in-depth solution. Before giving a solution, he gives you a historical presence before giving you a solution. And that's one of the few things that you will take when you re-listen back to this broadcast. The only future I see moving forward for black people is what they're going to do now, with everything that's laid out. You could sit there and watch lectures all day, every day, but if there's no actions critical or taking actions now, all what you have done to this point is of loss. And to be honest with you, a set of people cannot rise no better if they're not taking the necessary actions to fix their problems, solving their problems. Because the more problems you do solve, the greater and stronger you become as a people, race of people, especially you as men. The more you could critically think your way out of the box for any problem and solve the problems, which, you know, not everything you do is going to be perfect, but make an attempt to really put your head down and try to figure out your problems and what solution you could take to correct the problems, you have a better shot of actual survival in the 21st century. I see nothing more different than what I'm seeing now for black people. And like I said, the future is very vague. It's very uncertain. But I'll tell you one thing. There's going to be someone out of the group or out of our people that's going to figure out and solve the biggest problem that we face as people. And, you know, we might see it in our lifetime or see it down the line. But at the end of the day, there got to be somebody that's going to do it. Now, whether that person figures it out, will black people as a whole support it? We shall see. So, like always, I'd like to thank everybody for listening to this stream. If you find the stream helpful, please leave a comment at the end of this podcast. Make sure you like the stream, share the stream, and also hear the stream on all playbacks of outlets, podcasts, music outlets. That's pretty much it. Until next time.
Let the chaos reign.